might have seen, where we have our own Mind, Brain and Education Research Center called the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning, embedded actually in the school, as Ian said. And our goal is to help teachers get better by making learning research useful. Now, America loves abbreviations. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which in the US is starting to include emerging field of research on belonging. And Mind, Brain and Education, MBE, while hotly debated by academics, is in practice in real schools similar to the science of learning or educational research, educational neuroscience or evidence-based practice. And I know that evidence-based practice is a common notion in the UK, but in the US, it's a term that's looked upon frostily because it has some serious baggage. So when we say MBE, we mean evidence-based practice with some sprinkled in emerging insights as we discover more about how the brain works and learns. And the journey to this talk begins several years ago when we began to realize how much these two fields, DEI and MBE, intersected each other. It's pretty unusual to find a research center in a school, and everything we're about to share with you about the connectivity between DEI, belonging, and MBE came out of the day-to-day conversations that happen when researchers and diversity practitioners are running around the same campus and teaching the same students. So in addition to the roles you see on the screen, we are both teachers in the classroom every day. I teach physics, chemistry, and robotics, and have coached football, soccer for 22 years. So I get to build robots. I get paid to build robots, play football, and work in the science of teaching and learning, which is a pretty good life. And this is a very weird year for me because it's now 25 years growing up in the UK, followed by 25 years teaching in the US. Lorraine, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Lorraine Martinez Hanley, and as Ian said, I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion here at St. Andrews. I'm also a faculty fellow with the CTTL, where Ian is housed. I've done consulting with schools and organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now belonging, and also around mind-brain education. I've worked with student leaders with the National Association of Independent Schools over the past 15 years, probably 2,000 students a year. And a lot of our MBE strategies have been incorporated into how we help students facilitate difficult conversations that they want to have and grow and just have more advocacy in themselves. So thank you for having me here today with you all.
So we're going to do this in the style of a US late night chat show. I'll provide some framing and introduce an MBE idea, and then we'll invite Lorraine to tell you a story, and we'll unpack those. These are emerging ideas, and we're bound to, there'll be things that we get right and places where we've missed something. So we're really excited to share this with you and hear your feedback in Slido as we go, and I give you some ways to get in touch with us at the end of this presentation.
So one of the things we've been thinking about, and before we go on, I just want to give credit to two of our colleagues who are not here with us today, Ava Schultes and Stephanie Tellis. In this work, emerging work, Ava and Stephanie have been instrumental in helping us come up with the graphics and the language to invite educators to these conversations and to make these connections. So
thank you.
We've been thinking about our students, right, Ian? Our students at the center. They're always at the center of the work we do. But this past 18 to 12 months have been incredibly challenging for us, but at putting students at the center for students. So many things around their worlds have been in motion, right? One student said it's like juggling hula hoops, right? Thinking about the pandemic and the impact it has had on them, their families, their friends, and just watching the impact it had on the world. Learning to have to learn differently using technology, right? Or having even access to that technology and having it function for them on the day-to-day. Family stressors. As you can see in one of these bubbles, family stressors, families being impacted by jobs, maybe being home more with their children, the economic impact that that has had, along with the racial reckoning that I think may be more centered, some people might feel in the United States, but also around the world. I don't think what was happening in the US was solely being transmitted here. I think the world got to watch some of our imperfections and just the polarization at times around different events, different philosophies, different pieces of their identities. So all of these things impacting students. And of course, you, me, Ian, right? Ian and I sat yesterday thinking about how all these things have impacted us.
And what a year.
Right? And how at times we had to like push them aside, but they never really, they were always there. They were always in our brains. We just maybe needed to put something in front of it, but they never really went away. And how we also had to juggle and navigate these things while helping others, specifically our students. And while some of these may have impacted you, there might be others that you might be thinking about. So as part of our mind-brain practice too, right? We're just gonna pause. That's my word. I was telling Ian, that's my word for this year and the coming year. We're gonna pause to give you a second to think about, you saw some of those images, but what other things might be on your mind, in your brain, besides these, or in addition to?
If you have Slido up, throw them into Slido. Some things that might be in your bubbles.
Anything coming through on Slido by chance, Ian?
No, but they said there was a large delay, there was a long delay. And,
Okay.
and so maybe we'll move on. If anything brilliant comes up, we'll wrap it into the next section.
And it's really, I just want to pause again to say, it's really important for us to think about ourselves. We don't always have that opportunity, but in the work that we do at educating students and helping our coaching colleagues, it's really important for us to identify these things because they're not going away. So we need to just be mindful of them and aware of them.
So Lorraine, it's our first chat show moment. How's your sofa?
I'm comfy, Ian. I don't know about you, but I'm nice and comfy on mine.
Excellent. Now, students are experiencing unprecedented challenges, and all of this, emotion and cognition and stress and identity are inextricably intermixed. And we need to start seeing them that way too. So can you tell us about a moment where you saw this connection between mind, brain, and education, between MBE and DEI?
Well, I think I'll just go briefly back to when I did my MBE training over a decade ago, right? And I just couldn't help but think about the aspects of trying to understand my bias around learning and how students learned, and then also kind of thinking about the biases I may have around students' identities and their identity markers, Ian. So that kind of got me started. And I've been thinking about the end of the year here, right? As we are finishing up, and I know you still have a few weeks to go in schools.
We just finished up last week.
We're not quite finished because we're still in meetings, but but our students we finished up with our final exams. And I'm thinking about how it is important to think about those things that have impacted our students in their identities that have now walked into the classroom and that we've seen maybe or observed, and that we can't help but think about, even if they take this break over the next 8 weeks for us, 6 weeks for all of you, how can we not make these two connections, given their experiences and their challenges, and let's give them credit, the resilience they've had, right, to complete and do the things that they've done. So Ian,
I'm looking ahead to next year. Like, how do we take this and in the time we have this summer, what's the autumn going to look like when students return back to school? And do you have some thoughts about how this connection between MBE and DEI might look come the new school year?
Right, school has always been, for some students, the routine, the stabling force, right? I get up, I go to school, I know school is there. School has this bit of safety maybe more for some than others in different ways, depending on how they show up and what identities they carry. But school is a stabilizer for some. It's what they can depend on.
So knowing that it's been a weird year and starting again, I think I'm going to have to really work hard at getting buy-in for all my students at the start of the year, and helping each student feel like their identity is confirmed in my class, that they feel like they can belong and be part of this group of students learning in my class in our school.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, Ian, about how we just have to be mindful not to just erase what we've learned from the past and not deny them those experiences, but say, even with those challenges, you're going to be okay. We're going to keep moving forward, right? We're going to keep moving, and we know that through MBE, these other things of neuroplasticity, and you're going to be okay. Right. You're going to make it.
The brains are still really highly plastic. There's a lot of brain rewiring that can happen over this year and the next few years. But knowing that there's going to be challenges, I'm really thinking about how can we use those insights from the science of learning on feedback and formative assessment and metacognition, self-regulation, and teaching strategies, memory strategies to help students study better. Knowing that there's going to be all these challenges, and sort of like, what can I do to make my teaching as good as possible and reduce the stress that might be in the classroom?
Right. I don't want my stress showing up, Ian, right? When they may not have as much stress as I do. So I want to be mindful of myself as that educator.
Oh, excellent. So, in academia and teacher professional development, mind, brain, and education and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are treated separately and siloed. And as a teacher, we're lucky if we get one of these areas, and it's a rare person who gets both. But if we think about what students experience every day and what teachers experience every day, we realize they're highly connected, and that MBE research and strategies can help support us in pursuit of DEI goals. So when we started our process, we just made a list of all the places where we saw connection. And this Venn diagram was born, but it's pretty overwhelming. And the world contains too many Venn diagrams, and it doesn't really tell us how to go about doing this work. So we asked ourselves, if the goal is equitable learning for all students, what needs to happen first? What's the starting point? And we constructed another diagram with 5 steps, and we're just going to walk you through these 5 steps.
So we talked about, right, our own identity. What are the things that we need to be thinking about in ourselves? Because we show up. There is a power dynamic in our classroom. Our students look to us to have the answers, right? To know what their needs are, but how do sometimes our own identity markers get in the way of those things? Where do we need to be reflective and aware of ourselves and where we're coming in and what experiences we've had, right? Are we carrying profiles of students and their identities with us and kind of blurring them in on the next level with our current students that we're going to engage with? So just being aware of ourselves and our students' identity. Where is their opportunity in all that we have to do? But this is critical. This is essential. This is like a non-negotiable. Where do we know our students? How can they bring their authentic selves into the space, right? Where can their culture, their values, their thoughts live in our classrooms, and they can be comfortable letting you know that? Where are you providing that opportunity for them to share with you, but also with their peers? And how important is that? You know, we talk about I'll give one example with names and pronouns, right? That here, those are very important things to some of our students. So where can we be mindful of that?
Mm-hmm. The structure of the rest of our time is going to focus on the next three levels that come after these identity levels, because we can't tell you about your own identity or your students' identities, but that work is a prerequisite that we cannot skip over. Even though as educators we'll want to jump right to the top, which is belonging and positive academic and social identity development, we cannot skip the bottom. So safety. Once we know who our students are, and this is hard and ongoing work, our next most important task is to create a space that prioritizes for each their academic, psychological, and physical safety. Stress, trauma, and identity threat are barriers to learning, and we need to understand their impact. And we need to work to reduce them in our sphere of influence. In addition to knowing our students' names and pronouns, are we using inclusive language? Have we designed a curriculum that our students see themselves in? And for students who learn differently than us, are we recognizing neurodiversity? Is this a safe place to make mistakes? Do we believe in the ability of the brain to change with effort and practice? Do we understand and believe in neuroplasticity? And can our students feel that we believe this about each of them individually? You need to feel safe before you can feel like you belong.
Yeah, that safety builds that trust that's essential to be able to navigate adversity, right? And belonging is so important to our students because it gives them a sense that school is a place where they can socially connect, they can feel supported, respected, and valued. They trust their teachers, they trust their peers, and they feel a sense of school fit. This is a good place. This is like home. This is like a second home, right? They feel a good sense of fit. They're not worried about being treated as a stereotype or profiled in a certain way, but they're seen as individuals, and that each person is valued so that others belonging of self, but also belonging of others.
And then at the top.
And then we have the top, which is, you think, oh, we've reached it, but it's a big one, and it's a continued one, because we have these students for their most developmental years, academic development, as well as their identity development, how they can build that confidence and that security to make mistakes, to learn, to grow, and know that they are still being held by their schools, by their teachers, by their counselors, whatever member of the community is there for them. And we know that belonging in those early years can last beyond into adulthood, to give them the confidence to take those risks, those academic risks, to take those risks of trying new things. The research tells us that.
And these top two blocks of belonging, identity development are just, they resonate so much with all educators. This is the work that we really, really want to do. That's so impactful. But we've got to remember to build that on a solid foundation of my identity and my students' identities, and creating safe environments in order to do this work. And the two sides, the DEI and the MBE side, give us a toolkit of strategies based in research on both sides to help us on this upwards journey. There's also recursiveness that we didn't really capture on paper. So, for example, as a student, we encourage student voice and feedback, And as we do so, we might be thinking about belonging, but as we do that, we are uncovering something about our students' identities or our own identities, or information about how our own identity is turning up in the class and shaping things. And we have to go back and re-examine that. So of course, it's not as linear as the diagram makes out. I'm going to share a copy of this with you to work with later in the presentation. But I want to start with safety and the effect of stress. The amygdala is in charge of our fear response, like a little nut-shaped thing in the middle of our brain. I used to think of it like points on a railway line switching back and forth. But in her wonderful book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Zarita Hammond calls it the guard dog. So now I also think of it as a guard dog. When we feel safe, the amygdala is communicating with and engaging our prefrontal cortex, which is where working memory and executive functioning and all our other higher order cognitive processes live. But when it perceives a threat, the train track switch, or the guard dog, disengages our prefrontal cortex and engages our hindbrain, our lizard brain, and sends us into fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode at the expense of complex thinking. And this happens to us all when we experience episodic stress, like talking to lots of people. But in schools, some level of stress is good, in part because it helps create healthy stress response systems. And it helps us use our thinking brain in stressful situations. But the stress level is important because too much stress can shut down learning. And if we're exposed to prolonged and repeated stress, also known as toxic stress, we see scarier consequences. On brain scans, we see a decrease in the volume of the prefrontal cortex where all the complex thinking is happening, as well as the hippocampus, which is where we consolidate working memory into long-term memory. So now storing information into long-term memory gets a lot harder. The amygdala actually enlarges, so now you have a guard dog that's overprotective. We see damage in the VTA and NA, which are key parts of the brain's reward circuit, which dulls our sensitivity to reward, reduces motivation, but can cause us to engage in high-risk behaviors in pursuit of something that's more potent. And this is especially concerning the young people who don't have fully developed prefrontal cortexes to inhibit them from doing so. Their prefrontal cortex is still undergoing massive development into their mid-20s. Our body overproduces cortisol and cytokines, which is great if you are running from a bear, but if these are in your circulation for prolonged periods of time, because you're always or often in this stress mode, that leads to all kinds of chronic physical health and mental health conditions, some of which might not show up till later. And there are epigenetic effects, so affecting how genes are expressed, and evidence of intergenerational epigenetic effects, which is really scary. So with stress, some is good, but lots is not. I want you to think and just, what are some sources of stress in school for your students, for your pupils? And if you have Slido up, just take a moment to type in. And if not, just think.
And I'm thinking, Ian, I think you touched on it, just how that stress, what might stress me, might not stress you the same way, may not have that same impact, that same level of cortisol, right? Might not show up in you for that same experience.
And for some students, walking up the hill towards the school campus carries stress every day. So they're always in, I'm seeing a bear mode. And think about how identity is linked with the feeling of stress maybe in school. A related topic is cognitive load. The cognitive load is important, but especially so in this weird year. This is a simple model of memory, a beautiful diagram by Oliver Caviglioli, based on Dan Willingham's classic. You can see that we're attending to some small fraction of the stimuli in the environment and processing that in working memory, where it's bringing in some information from long-term memory to help do that. then we're consolidating that information from working memory into long-term memory. That's remembering. And then we're either retrieving it later or forgetting what we don't use. Long-term memory, as far as we know, has an unlimited capacity, but the attention and working memory are really limited, and they create a bottleneck in our information processing. And the demands we place on the working memory are known as cognitive load. And it's important to think about where we can minimize extraneous cognitive load in our instructional design, how we manage our classrooms. Because if the cognitive load is too high, if there's too much extraneous load, no learning can happen. Or students are able to learn in the moment, but there's not enough cognitive load to write schema back into their long-term memory, so learning doesn't happen. And the connection from MBE to DEI is that social, emotional, and environmental stressors are also sources of cognitive load. And that reduces our mental bandwidth. So you may have heard of Claude Steele's research on stereotype threat. It's a powerful illustration of this, that even an unconscious concern about our identity can take up cognitive load bandwidth and hinder our performance. So again, think about stress and cognitive load, and just pause for a moment. Think about what's in your student's mind right now that might be impacting their cognitive load. What might be in your student's mind right now that's impacting their stress? Or what might be impacting your cognitive load as a teacher? What might be impacting your stress as a teacher? Because that impacts your students too. Take a moment to think about those. And after that, we're back on the couch. Thank you for whoever put in the current hybrid teaching model.
Yes, and for us and our students, yeah. I think at times.
Somebody put in a recent post, but it's relevant here too, that LGBTQ issues and accepting the difference of opinion and thinking, that's huge for many students. It's the stress of the assessment and the exam system and knowing that they're really important grades that are going to matter, and the sense of what a mess. It's been just as messy here as it has for you. So Lorraine, where do stress and cognitive load factor in your classroom in the school?
Well, I've been thinking about the language and the feedback that I got from students about that deficit language that's been out there, and that their parents are concerned about, right? Of the loss of learning. So as we've always talked about this loss of learning in the summer during the break, right? That there's a loss of learning. But now with the pandemic and other factors, we're really hearing students starting to internalize that language. You and I were talking about this yesterday, right? And feeling that they've fallen so far behind, they're never going to catch up. They always feel that when they don't do well on an assessment. They feel like they've fallen so far behind and they're not going to catch up. But now with the impact of everything, right? How do we language things when they come back to us, right? Because even with that break, I was thinking about that bottleneck, right? There's still going to be some of that bottleneck there that is not going to clear it. And so even with hearing, am I going to be behind? Did I learn what I needed to learn to be successful now in this coming next year with its next course? Where and how is that going to show up?
I'm really thinking a lot about what's the mindset of my students going to be when they come back, and to a degree, has their confidence taken a beating? Right. And how do I see myself as a student? How do I see my own academic identity development? And what can I do to help bolster that?
And we're talking about that in the academic part of their development, but also in their social part. I remember hearing students talk about, I'm going to come out of hybrid and come into school. And are my friends going to be there? I mean, they voice that. Are my friends going to be there? Am I going to still, or how am I going to rebuild those connections with my peers? Right? Because that's a huge part of their confidence, of how they walk and they engage in a room, right? Are my friends still going to be there?
As we look through so many of the strands, both in the DEI research, but also in the MBE research, I'm really struck by how many of them are underpinned by strong positive relationships. And so one part of the wonderful bits of our journey was like something that's so, such an ancient idea about the importance of, and such a human idea, the importance of relationships. And I'm thinking about next year, how important it is, where there's so many, there are going to be so demands on time to make time for relationship building. For me to make relationships with my students, but also for students to build positive relationships with each other. So how in my class, even though I'm teaching physics, what does that look like in my physics class to make relationship building a key part of the start of the year?
And in that relationship building, back to how then is that an opportunity for me to know my students and see aspects and markers of their identity and how they engage.
I'm thinking about how to support them academically as well. What are some, we've talked a lot about using formative assessment. Do you have anything, tell something about how you've started using formative assessment in recent years?
Well, I think for me, formative assessment is key, right? For myself. And it kind of, as I roll it out to students, I say, it's an opportunity for me to know whether I've done my job with you, right? Versus, did you learn what I thought I taught you? Did I do my job? Have you learned what I thought I taught you? Right? So I kind of reframe it with them versus them showing me what they know. Did I show you did I actually teach you what I thought I taught you? So even languaging that formative assessment different and using it to inform me of, I thought I did what I needed, or I'm sure I did what I needed to do, but obviously there's maybe some holes in this, like Swiss cheese, right? So I need to fill those. And how can I use the formative assessment to help me with that, which in the end will help my students, right?
So I'm thinking of in next year, I'm not going to put anything on a summative assessment that hasn't been on a formative assessment at some point. Formative before summative always, which is something I should have been doing. I realize I should have always been doing that. I guess it'd be kind of unfair. I mean, if I don't check that I've taught it well before I give you a test on it.
Right. And I don't know if there's a requirement, but we talked about quizzes, right? So if I'm giving formative assessment, do I need to give a quiz? Or is the formative assessment the quiz? Or am I giving a formative assessment, a quiz, and an assessment? So what are the purpose of those?
I've been thinking about that buy-in in the next year of how do I get students to start feeling like they can be successful, keep having high expectations and high standards, but reducing stress about learning, reducing cognitive load about learning. What are some stresses? Has this sparked any thinking about you? What are you seeing in your classes? Put something inside. There's a 30-second delay, and so some things sometimes come in a little bit late.
We'll pause, Ian, to be a little more patient.
What have you observed about cognitive load and stress? After listening to our chat, what changes could you make? Somebody put in a comment for something else, but I think it's applicable here. It says, understanding what works for young people. And that reminded me of I teach it reminds me to build in room for that in my classes. And I was thinking, looking ahead for next year, I teach physics. And so I'm going to put in some more labs at the start of the year to give myself a chance. And they're good labs and they have some good stuff, but this is really to give me a chance to walk around and start to figure out, so what's up? To try to get to know you and to figure out where you are and to help kickstart our year instead of making assumptions.
And I think, Ian, this year we experienced where we just said, what are students going to need to be successful in the next course, the next grade? We really paused to be mindful of that, to minimize that stress and cognitive load. We gave ourselves permission and maybe some grace to really look at what is absolutely necessary, right? And what things can be cut out.
There's a great thing that came out in the chat says we need to be cautious of the stresses the pandemic has placed on learners. Absolutely, but we need to also figure out what those stresses are by talking to students and not making the assumptions, and finding what really is on people's minds. But that takes relationship building, which is great work for teachers. So just as an illustration of what we're talking about bringing in strategies from DEI and MBE to build safety, we could get used to students receiving feedback and giving you feedback from the DEI side on the left there. We can make community agreements and revisit community agreements periodically, or community norms for the classroom, and keep them up to date and relevant. And from the MBE side, we could bring in research on homework to reduce the workload and increase learning quality. We could give better instructions, always number it, short sentences. We can work on classroom management. And again, give a shout out to Doug Mamov's book, Teach Like a Champion, and Tom Bennett's Running the Room. And you may have completely different strategies to focus on according to your context and your needs and your areas of expertise. But we want to illustrate this idea that if we take an approach where we're bringing in strategies from DEI and MBE to help fill this need, we'll get to better solutions. And both these subjects offer great evidence-based, research-based strategies to help us. So to reorient quickly, we've just been talking about safety, and we're now going to move a step upwards towards belonging. And this is one of my all-time favorite studies. I love it because on the surface, it's about the power of language, and I love language. But if we imagine beyond the frame of this study, it makes me think about how we back up our words with actions. So David Yeager and his colleagues recruited black and white 7th graders in US schools who were earning B's and C's and asked them to write a personal essay. Their real teachers wrote comments on the essays, but before the students got them back, the researchers randomly clipped one of the 2 notes onto the paper, which I'll give you a second to read on the screen. And then the teachers invited students optionally to revise and resubmitted their essays. Would you expect that these simple notes to make any meaningful difference to students' responses? I'll let you look at the graph for a moment. If you look at the results, particularly the 2 bars on the right representing the black students, we can see that pairing critical feedback with high expectations and assurance of students' ability to meet them made a significant difference in their motivation to revise and resubmit the work. It's not shown in this graph, but the researchers also measured school trust. And the impact of high expectations and assurance was especially strong for students who self-reported lower levels of trust in the policies and procedures of the school, which is the case in the US of many black students and others in marginalized groups. And this study is great. I love this study, but it got me thinking, what happens after the researchers leave? They parachute in, they're in it for a couple of weeks. What happens next? What can the teachers do for every day for the rest of the year to back up these words? What should pedagogy and feedback look like to truly set high expectations for all students and provide each student with the tools to reach them? I think this is part of the essence of belonging, that each student believes this and believes that this school, this is the place where it can happen. It's an article in Edutopia that I got to write about this idea, which has sort of launched one of the things that propelled us forward. But Lorraine, what could belonging look like in the school? What are some of the non-belonging? What can we do to build belonging? And what are some of the non-belonging weeds for us to pull?
I think you're gonna tap on some of these, but I'll kind of think about belonging doesn't mean that we're not uncomfortable, we're not challenged, right? Belonging means that we've created these for rituals, that we've created these opportunities in our classrooms, for example, where students are going to be acknowledged and seen, and they get to see that their peers and others, and how important those things are. You mentioned briefly earlier about community agreements, right? A list of things that collaboratively with that shared responses from students of what do they need to have what I like to call green brains. Their brains are green and ready and eager to learn, right? What are the things they need? And as a community in a class, what things have they agreed upon to be aware of? So whether it's how you greet them at the door, and I think you have a good story to tell us on that, Ian, right? Or it's an opportunity to share what things could be distracting in a class, right? Where do we pause and take time to build those in so that we can actually get to those things that we want students to learn? So maybe you want to share that one.
You want to share that? So you've probably seen the YouTube videos of the teacher, and it's probably a US teacher. It seems like a US kind of thing to do, sorry, that creates the personal greeting for every student. And they stand by the door and give each student the personalized handshake. Well, Chris Emdin, who's one of our favorite people, a wonderful professor at Columbia University in New York, tells this story of somebody he knew who came to him and says, Chris, I think I've lost my class. They just, you know, I think I've just lost them for the year. And he asked them what happened. And the teacher said, you know, I was doing the personalized greeting thing and it was wonderful. You know, the kids were really bought in, they loved it. But then I realized it was taking me 15 minutes at the start of every class. And I just didn't have the time, so I just stopped doing it. And they said, and now they think I'm a fake. Now they think I'm a fake. Now they think I don't believe. And Professor Emden's response was, yeah, I think you've lost your class. I think you've lost your class for the year. We create these rituals, and the rituals have tremendous power.
And connection, right? Learning is connection. Relationships are connections. And that's, I think, that connection, even if it was that personal handshake connection, that was gone. So that impacted, right?
There was a way to do it that doesn't take 15 minutes every day. But it's still like we've got to build that into every class. And it's not the responsibility. We can't just leave it to that one teacher who's really good at this stuff. That it works when it looks, you know, it looks uniquely different to each individual classroom,
right?
But it happens everywhere in the school.
And you mentioned the weeds, and I'm thinking about how many times do I say, well, I want you to have the number 2 pencil, right? And you can't use blue ink, you can only use black ink. Are those weeds that are, I didn't bring the black ink pen today, right? Is that something that's not going to make me belong to this group now in a way of like, my performance is going to be impacted because I don't have the blue or the black ink pen. Those are like little things that sometimes we add on that maybe aren't necessary. You know, we think it's not a big deal, but it could be a big deal if I can't get a pen with black ink or blue ink.
One of the things that really blew me away was the people have done research on the wait time we give students, and we don't give wait time equally to our students. We tend to give less wait time to certain students. And so we think about who's given the opportunity to struggle and think hard, and who's not. Another sort of thinking, if something like simple, basic as wait time is a problem, then where else is there a problem? Something like we totally take for granted. Where else is there things? Can you share the story of the student who walked into the class late?
Oh, there was a student who walked into his teacher's classroom and they walked in late. And some other students walked in late, and they walked in, they told the teacher sorry and sat down, sorry and sat down. This one student walks in and doesn't say sorry, just nods their head and sits down. Well, the teacher was very upset and felt totally disrespected because the student didn't say, I'm sorry. And in the teacher's opinion, didn't look remorseful. So the teacher came down, wanted to know how to navigate the student, wanted to think, is there something that might be in the way? And a quick conversation of, what does sorry look like to you? And the teacher quickly went into, well, when I was growing up, if I didn't say I was sorry and my shoulders didn't go down and I didn't put my head down and look remorseful, that would not have been acceptable in my house. That would have been totally disrespectful. So are we imposing sometimes things that how we would react and expecting our students to react in those same ways? And I just asked the teacher, do you think that maybe in that student's house, nodding, making that brief eye contact and sitting down was respectful? Could that be how in their home, that's the expectation? And so it was interesting to just see that and take a moment of what we think is acceptable and think that maybe it might be just a little different for our students.
Could we sort of wrap this up with we talked about relationship building, how the relationship building played out between that student and that teacher as the year went on?
So about 4 months later, the teacher sent me an email and said, oh my goodness, I want you to know this student who she no longer teaches came by and just sat on the desk and started talking to me and said, hi, how are you? How have you been? It's been a tough year. How has your year been? And the teacher was thrilled and felt like, oh, I must have made a connection. I made a connection with this. And I said, absolutely, you did. The student came out of nowhere with the days that we were in person and found you and sat and just had a brief conversation of, hello, how are you? How was your year? My year's not been so great. I'm sure yours hasn't. And I just reminded the teacher, I said, so what next? When are you going to find that student next? And just go sit by them and ask them how they are. Because she took that time. Now, we then, as educators, when's our next step? Or do we end it there and say, oh, good, this must be good? Or is there a follow-up? And do we think that follow-up is important to continue that sense of belonging?
Yeah. The belonging is an ongoing journey, and all our language and all our facial expressions and body language and the things we say and don't say.
Yeah, because you talked about feedback, and we're giving feedback formally or informally, right? How we greet our students, where we're standing. If they're asking us a question and we're looking down and taking notes, are we giving them that feedback of what you're saying is important? We're constantly giving feedback informally that we may not even be aware of. How I respond to a question that you ask is going to tell other students whether they can also ask a question.
I remember we were looking at some of the research from Bob Dylan about, and a lot of teachers here, me included, realized that we had in effect made teacher fortresses in the corner of our room with like the big walls that said, this is my space. And those are like 20% of the real estate of the classroom. They're like, don't come here, this is me, I do teacher here. And then sort of changed our classrooms so that and change how we move around the rooms just to feel like there's more of a connection.
And the importance of, like Gilliam Williams, I just want to make sure we say feedback is two-way. Where are we also making sure students can give us feedback on our practices and pedagogy and rituals and routines that we're creating, that it's actually working? When are we providing that formal and informal, just in a day-to-day, a question of how do you think this lesson went? What did you take from it? What could have made it better? Just taking that opportunity as well.
And Dylan's key point with feedback about the emotional climate in which the student receives the feedback really matters. It's whether anything happens with that feedback. And how many times when I was, as a young teacher, I'd write the same thing again and again to the student and nothing was happening. And it sort of clicked that, I've got some work to do to build that emotional climate so that feedback is acted on. And that's work that I need to do.
I think we have 3 minutes, Ian.
Yeah. So what are some ways that we can pull from the DEI and the MBE to help support belonging. Again, these are just examples. We've talked about some, here are some others, but if we use both these toolkits and adapt them to our scenarios, we'll more likely to be successful, impactful.
And I just want to add one thing onto that belonging, that it does not mean that you have to feel good all the time. It means we can give. Students can have challenges, and that students can be worried about how they're learning. And they can also receive that critical feedback. When they have that sense, all those things can still happen. It's not about making them feel good 100% of the time.
Right, that's it. It's about, like, how do you build the climate so they're not feeling good 100% of the time, but still having those conversations. Yes. So the last slide we made is the identity strand.
And we just think about that social identity that is being developed when they're with us, and their academic identity. And we know the way the brain works, they're tied together, they're not separate. They're kind of dependent on each other. And so where is the LGBT student? Where is the student whose family structure is not maybe being described in the class, right? It's not the normal, quote unquote, or the typical family that we find in a textbook or we find in a storybook. Where are those things happening that we can be more cognizant of? Where are they showing up on our curriculum, right? Or their orientation, language, right? That is a big one that plays out as well. So how does that feed into affirming them and making sure that they can get that academic belonging that Ian is referring to?
Students are constantly building and refining their identity. And this is the wonderful joys of being a teacher. One of the strands that we're focused on as educators is academic identity. My sense of myself as a student, that I belong in this academic environment and can be successful here. We want successful student and lifelong learner to be part of each student's developing identity. But this demands high quality pedagogy from all teachers. The language we use, the relevance of our assignments, giving our students a toolbox of skills to use and the knowledge of when to use them, developing self-efficacy, that feeling of confidence and increasing independence. We all need to understand DEI and MBE and draw from both fields to foster this academic and social belonging to make this wonderful learning journey possible. And this was revision 1 of our pathway for doing it. And we'd love your feedback on it. As you're building upwards, we're pulling in strategies from the two sides in order to make that happen. This is our pathway for building lasting change over time.
We just want you to remember they're intersecting, they're crossing over. And so we're all on this journey, and just we can take multiple crosswalks to get there.
It's a messy crossroads.
Yes.
Of different fields. But if you take the long-term goal and we look about change over time.
Absolutely.
Please stay in touch. Please share your stories. If you want more freebies about the science of learning, DEI, and how they intersect, please write to us or visit our website, cttl.org. And we wish you all the best for the end of this school year. Yes. and for a restful and relaxing summer and a successful beginning come the autumn.
Thank you.
That's us. Thank you. I think we have.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
Has one of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.